So the rule is I take no more than 30 minutes. I don't plan to take any, hopefully not anywhere near that. And then a Q&A, brief, and then, but at the end we're going to do a colloquy or a discussion over some questions. And I sent that out, and I don't know if you noted, but they're just suggestions. So that's what we're going to do today. I think it could be kind of fascinating and fun. But the reading that was provided was called the Apostolic Life. And I guess what a moment ago I was trying to say, I was a little bit frustrated by this reading because in all the time, this reading is by Father Becaire, who was a Frenchman and was written in the 60s. You know, it doesn't matter how old some of this stuff is, even if it's 800 years old, it still has increasing value as time passes. But my frustration with this was I thought it was going to dive deep into the lay apostolate, which it didn't. And it was giving us an example. So I guess part of what the purpose of this is, because it starts out talking about lay apostolate, must be securely rooted in reality. It must be normal, healthy growth in the irreversible pattern of the church's life. And what does that mean? Is that we can't invent what we want in the church's ministry. We can't wish things to happen. We see a lot of wishing going on in our society, both involving things that are irreversible, such as sex, and those things that may be reversible, but what we're not called to. And one of the things by which example is women becoming priests. By whatever decree, by whatever announcement, by whatever authority, no such thing can exist. So we have this, so the lay apostle is no different than the church itself. It must be grounded in reality and truth. And so when it speaks, and this is the preface, and from here I thought, and it's been a while since I've read this, because to be frank with you, I've had this for a long time. And it was given to me by Father Bartolotore. But this reading didn't go anywhere near what the role of the laity might be in the modern world, even though this came out during the period of, I think it was published in 66, so this would be immediately post Vatican II, which is scary because how old this is. But I think there's some still values to look at with regard to the apostle. It talks about the monks and the apostolic life in general. So maybe at the end of the discussion, what we should summarize is how do we look at this? How do we, as lay people in the Dominican order, as third order, as lay fraternities, I use both lay fraternities and third order, as in our lives, both in the church, outside the church, and wherever we go. And so the apostles lived, let's see, where is my... You know, as a very amateur economist and philosopher and political scientist, I'm always taken aback by the words in the book of Acts at 4:32. You know, and it says it in two places in there. Let me see if I can show you. But it does touch right smack on the apostolic life in the early church and what it meant. And so the question might be, what does that mean for us today? Let me go there real quick. That's Acts 4:32. If I can find it. Now the company of those, and they're talking about the apostles, and obviously those disciples that were following them, who believed were of one heart and soul. And no one said that any of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had everything in common. And with great power the apostles gave their testimony of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. And so the character, obviously at the time of the apostles, was And this is the narrative that we hear from the pulpit and also from the classroom when I heard it in school was, well, this was the apostles, but they eventually abandoned this. And that's the story I kind of took to heart at one point. But that indeed is not true, because I think possessing in common still exists. Anybody tell me where it now exists in the church?
Among the orders.
Among the orders, in the priories, and in the monasteries. And I never kind of equated that. And I always thought, I'm a political scientist by education, and that connection in reality got lost at times. But those things are not in the world as lay people. We don't hold things in common. But one of the characteristics I want to take away from that is today, at any rate, is the pillars. And this is how I'm going to relate it to the lay people in the reality of where we live today. When we talk about the reality, the preface says it's to be grounded in reality, normal and healthy. Well, we live in a community. So what does that mean? That doesn't mean that all that I possess belongs to you, but that we respond to each other in charity and in faith, and of course share the hope of those. And if those in need, we come to them and help them. And that's part of the lay community. That's who we are. And that's where we can participate. And there's the sharing in spirituality. The characteristics of spirituality we share in daily when we say these prayers and follow the rule. When you say when you say the morning office, I'm saying it with you, even though I may have done it an hour before at my home. The spiritual reality of what's going on is very true. But the reality is, too, that the friars and those in the Franciscans and the Benedictines are living in a state of evangelical councils which we do not follow. They make essentially, obviously they make vows, which we do not. But what I'm trying to say is, this is still very much alive, this aspect of the apostolic life. But for the lay people, that's the community. So what are the aspects of community? That obviously we don't share property with each other, which the apostles did, and that's part of what he calls the, what was that? Let's see. Good old Latin, I just love Latin, don't you? The Via Apostolica, in other words, the way of the apostles. The point is that, so we share in some aspect of that, and I think that the chapter meeting, when Mike shows up every month, I'm thankful. Carolyn, all of you, each one of you do. And, it's hard to say because the community has thrived through so much and fought, and yet there's these certain people that keep showing up. And that's the community aspect of life as a Dominican. So, he identifies some of the aspects, he being the author, Father Vicaire, of the apostolic life and the nature. And so let me see if I can find in the modern world, let me not go there, but let me see if I can find it's a really good analysis. Apostles led the way in the early church, and he talks about how we build these saintly statues and pictures that are kind of stark, and they have halos and the like. And he explains that why they did that. That goes all the way back. It's because that's decisions they made to live in accordance to what they didn't identify as a rule, but a way of life. That was how they lived in a real way. And that we participate in that. And that there's real life in these pictures that we think in the modern world is rather stark. And that the halos over them represent things that were very, very real to them. That they followed Christ, because it's in John 6:6, where the disciples of Christ, after giving the bread of life discourse, left. And Christ turns to Peter and the other disciples that stayed in and said, "What shall we do?" Or no. His question was, these are my questions. Yeah, are you also going to go away? I mean, and St. Peter turns to him, obviously speaking for the apostles, and says, "Who else are we to go to? How else can we survive? We believe in you." And what he was saying was, it was a declaration of the disciples then standing with him and the apostles via apostolic. I'm here. I'm walking. I'm going to be with you. I'm an apostle. Yeah, don't worry. I'm here. So this is a statement that we too want to state as lay apostles. Yes, we sin. Believe me, I'm a sinner. And regretfully, throughout my life. But I hope that my life, and I want to be the via apostolica, via the laity, to be able to participate in the gospel according to Christ and that way of life. So we're all called to that in the fullness in which we can participate, not in the fullness of a priest or the fullness of the religious or even the fullness of those who are brothers or lay brothers. Some of us can, but many of us can't, because we have a different reality. But the one thing we all share is the life of the apostle in the laity. And this calling goes all the way back. I was talking to Father Bart yesterday, the Latori. Now, Father Bart hasn't been here he visited a couple of years ago, maybe 3, I don't remember. But anyway, he lives in Mexicali. He's originally from LA. I got to know him in DC. He's quite a sharp guy. And he's been reading the book written by Father Augustine Thompson. I think it's Thompson. And he's a historian. He wrote a book about the laity, the history of the laity. But he also wrote a book called The Cities of God. Not the City of God by Augustine, but the cities of God. And in there he describes 1100 years ago, how the laity stepped up and helped reform the church in various ways. This is nothing new. Anybody who tells you that, of course, we formalized it through Vatican II, but the laity was seeing the need for reform within the church. And it was the laity that pushed forward, went to their bishops, went to their clerics, went to the priests and said, "We need change. We need reform." He told me a story that's in the book, so I'm going to buy the book. It's called The Cities of God again. Augustine Thompson is still with us. He's a friar in Oakland, and he's just a real good researcher. I mean, he's a character when it comes to giving talks and stuff. And I'd like to invite him up here. One of the things that he said was that, I think it was Leo III, at the time of the king of the Franks, he was in Rome. And Leo III, obviously, Leo III is the Pope. The king of the Franks, I forget his name. He's known as Charlemagne, which means Charles the Great. So his name would have been Charles. And he said during Mass, in the middle of Mass, Leo III stops, pulls a crown from under the altar, and runs over and crowns him. The Holy Roman Emperor. And in one way, of course, there's a lot of politics behind that. And this is the story I get from Father, and I'm laughing because, he puts things in ways that have real historical context, which we don't always read in the books. But it was this swift moment, and he didn't even know what was going to happen. All of a sudden, he is called to defend Rome and all of Western civilization, and he took it on. But as a layperson, as the king of the Franks, he opposed the Lombards and secured them and helped them become Christians, and against the outside attacks. Lombards literally mean, in French, in original French, men with beards. And they were German. Now, obviously, Lombardy is a province in France, and they're Germanic in origin. But I just got a kick out of the story, because here was a Pope calling a layperson into protecting the See of Rome. But that's just one example. And he said during the, one of the things about the current scandal, the scandals that have impacted, diseased, inflicted the church, have endless, which we won't go into. This same issue occurred 900 years ago. I don't know if you knew that or not. What was the name of the saint that wrote against it? Who? That's it, Father Peter Damien. And he wrote a letter to the Pope about what was going on behind the scenes in the church. And he starkly defends it. Now, what happened is the lay people picked up and pressured the priests to do reform. So even back then, there was a huge amount of pressure on the church because they were getting very tired of the corruption. And how tired are you of the corruption in the church? And if not corruption, just bad acts. I guess that's corruption, right? It's just a consistency. And we're all sinners, don't get me wrong. But when it starts to inflict more people than not, then we have an issue. And that, I think, to some extent, we have been silenced by the world because of the failure of living right lives. That's the nature of it. Anyway, I'm getting off a little bit. But anyway, Jesus says, come follow me. And so the question is for us is, what does that mean for us? And so I'm trying to discern some of this stuff out of this reading that has an applicable message for us today. If anyone has any questions online, please wait till I'm done, and be glad to.
Nobody's online.
No one's online?
That's right.
Okay. All right. In one of the quotes, he quotes Philo, who lived at the time of Christ, actually, and he was he was a Jew, and he talked about some of the early monks of the Jewish order, They lived a life of prayer, poverty, harmonious. They were communal, and they also came into the early part of the church. So we have several characteristics, which also are pillars of the laity. There's prayer, community. He talks about poverty. No, we don't live in the type of poverty that they're talking about. I'll leave that off. That's not. But it's clear. What are the other pillars of Dominican life?
Preaching.
Study. Preaching. I'll put it this way, just Blessed Virgin Mary, devotion to her, among others. And there's no exactitude in the community or of the pillars, but these are reflected in monastic life as well, just as in a different order, way of saying it. Let's see. One of the characteristics, of course, of that they did so, they lived under a common rule. Which helped order the common life. Now, the common life is more than just community. What would be aspects of common life? Some of the aspects of common life. We're doing it right now. meeting together. And praying together. Common life also is communicating with one another, sharing the same spiritual aspects, praying the rule, participating in the rule, even though we're separated physically, we're together spiritually. So part of these aspects are still alive in us, but if you look all the way back to the Christ, when he was calling them to a way of the apostles, they were living together, acting together, praying together, eating together. We see this in the book of Acts. So what happened, I think, in the book of Acts, where they were living in community and shared all of that, that sharing ended in one sense is that the lay people no longer shared after a certain point of time. But those men and women who made decisions to live according to the apostolic life in its fullness, both spiritually and communally, began to live together very early in the church. Now, I got more exact in time, and this reading gets into the monks, which means only one, I think, one only. I mean, together, I mean, you're kind of weird meaning in a way. But the reality is that they lived an apostolic life in community and in reality. When I say reality, what I mean is physically together. So some of the things, so what I've tried to do is distill down and just take a moment down some of the aspects to this. So what do we do? And I wrote these down. It says we have obedience to the rule. And obedience to the rule, just actually the Dominicans are very strong with regard, at least in the community, the friars, to obedience, period. But obedience to the rule is what keeps us ordered in our lives and together and common in the sense when we sit down and talk to one another, have coffee or break bread together, we're speaking the same terms. So we look at the rule, we have that aspect of the friars. And then the pillars of Dominican life, another aspect of the Via Apostolica. Again, community, prayer, study, preaching, the Blessed Virgin Mary, among others. Online, if you go to, I don't remember which reading, but it's in the formation page, Father, it's another Augustine one, wrote about the pillars of Dominican life. And it's on there. And he has a number of others, a few others. And the next is in our public life. Not just with our brothers and sisters or with our spouses, but in work and in activity we do. We seek excellence in all that we do. And truth. Excellence and truth. Excellence. All of us fall short of this. I mean, I know I do, so I'll just speak for myself. But I know that I want to strive and do strive. All of us here do. So when we're going to work and we make a decision to participate and dedicate our work to Christ, we're participating in the Via Apostolica. So that when people see our work, at least to the extent that we have that expertise, to do the best we can, and try to work through it, then we are participating in that life. Actually, in the life of the apostles, which was kind of amazing to me. And then the pillars, and the common life, which is not necessarily, it's not community, it is the meetings, following the rule, saying prayers in accordance with the order, the charisms of the order, following them, in other words, living the charisms of the order, which include, we already spoke of, working achieving work in excellence. What else? The truth. Living the truth to the extent that we can. Understanding. Because it's in truth that our sins we can begin to change who we are. We can even descend into a depths unknown when we start lying to ourselves, which is a very common aspect of modern community. So these are, the common life is in the participation that makes us Dominicans, and the charisms of the order. What are some of the charisms of St. Dominic? The gifts, charisms meaning gifts of the Holy Spirit. One aspect, obviously, is abiding love for truth. I think that, it's a love that it reflects in what they say that when he spoke to you, he spoke of God and about God, not anything else. There's practical sides to that, but the reality is everything, even about making your bed, can be about God. Because at the end of the day, anybody read, I read it, it's a short book by General so-and-so about bake your bed every day. And it just came out of, I think, 4 years ago. But what it's about, is he tells the story about, as a young man, before, as he's joining the military, decides to he's told, make your bed every day. And obviously, the obvious answer to that is that put your day in order, that first act of order. So one of the charisms of St. Dominic for me is right order, putting things in order in your life. And good sense, or in other words, reasonableness, acting according to truth in reason. And of course, part of that being apostolic is full participation and frequent participation in the sacraments of the church. But this is so much bigger than what this subject matter can cover. But, I was reflecting a moment ago on how our sins, if we follow them, is darkness. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the point is, it's very clear in Romans 1 that sins can darken us in a way that is kind of scary. I encourage you to read it. It is a stark eye-opener if you haven't read it. Romans 1. But anyway, in closing, I encourage you to read this. It gives a great history about the monks, about early apostolic life, about the history, right down through our time, at least up to a few years ago, and what that meaning is for the modern world. But I was trying to shape it into what it means for us today, this Via Apostolica. Make a great article to write about what does this mean to Mike, to Brian, to Lana, to Karen, each one of us. What does it mean today? And the first time I read this, I thought, well, yeah, that's great. This is all theoretical. I'm at the time in law school. And, this is fantastic. This is, this is a different world. But there are aspects that are real and we can be a part of. And it's we've got to think, when it comes to us lay people, think outside that box. And so that's a statement, to say the least. I think one of the things in closing is it says here, and this is just a recall, and some of it's applicable to us, some of it is not. But in talking about the way of life of apostolic life, St. Bernard said, quote, "It is your life which makes the apostolic life present to the church today. he's speaking, 900 years ago. What does that mean? The apostles left everything and gathered together close to the Lord and lived under his tutelage. From the fountain of the Lord, they were able to draw the waters of joy, and the very wellspring itself, they drank the water of life. How fortunate the eyes of those who have seen him. But you yourself, it is not very much like that for you. Even though you no longer live in his presence, he is bodily absent, and you do not hear his words from his mouth, but from those he has sent. So we still participate within Christ, because obviously Christ is not just here spiritually. I just realized the fascinating thing, one of the aspects of the Holy Eucharist is that Christ is here in the third dimension. He's not just here spiritually, which our separated brethren would be, but you can participate with him in this dimension, the third dimension in the Holy Eucharist, by consuming it. By going and praying before him, you're actually talking and visiting and in company with the Lord. This, of course, obviously, is part of the Apostolic Life. And this is what Bernard is getting to, is and remember the testimony of Christ is blessed are those who saw me, but those who are greater who have faith in me and yet never saw me. Here, in one reality, and that's over the cover of bread and wine. And he has joined us in this world and continues to participate in it. And it's for us to try to understand that as lay people. And I think that I'm done.
Very good, Sam.
Any questions?
One remark about the Dominicans in particular and the Apostolic Life. And I guess it comes from Dominic. On the Feast of the Assumption of 1217, he sort of broke the community apart and sent people out in pairs, in very much the way that Jesus sends disciples out in pairs in the Gospel of Luke.
72.
Take no purse, take no change of clothes, and wherever you go, accept what's given to you. And so Dominic took that message to heart and said, if you just, the seed that is left unsown moulders, was molded. And it was not an easy message for the brethren to hear about how, you guys are going to Portugal, you guys are going to Italy, you guys are going to Paris. But that's exactly what he did in following Jesus and how Jesus sent his disciples forth. And so that way the Dominicans sort of apostolic in the sense of an apostle means someone who being sent forth. That's still true today. I mean, the Benedictines have stability. You went to that abbey and you stayed there for the rest of your life, whereas the Dominican friars are constantly getting tossed around here and there. I mean, Portland this year, next year in Anchorage, the year after that going down to Los Angeles, and they're constantly in motion, and that's been that way since St. Dominic himself. And that's based on Dominic's understanding that the apostles are getting sent.
Yeah, that's right. They discuss about that in the reading, and they talked about how Francis and St. Dominic kind of took, I think, the Via Media, the middle way, in a way at his time, because Francis, at least during his lifetime, they wanted them constantly moving, living in clay caves, or they didn't want priories or monasteries. They were in motion all the time. And St. Dominic realized that they needed, to some extent, places to stay, and you see that in the very early congregation of nuns at Pruy. I think it's Donahue is the It's at the bottom of the hill in southern France, bottom of the hill of Fanjot, where the original nuns go all the way back. The buildings are still there. So yeah, you see that. Of course, it's a place of prayer for the friars as they go out. Yeah, right. He sends them out. But the church, in reality, is never at rest, even though there's places of rest. So I think that's a really good point. But he does get into that kind of, not conflict, but that discussion that was going on with St. Dominic, and he finally just sent them out. And look what it did. One of them being, for instance, St. Hyacinth, who changed the world in Eastern Europe. So thank God he did. Bless the Polish people by it.
John, I don't know where I got this book. I think you bought a bunch of books, and I was one who got it. It's entitled Inside the Image of St. Dominic by anyway, he's a Dominican. And I can send it around if you'd like to see it. And it gets each and every major saint. St. Thomas Aquinas, of course, studied his search for truth. And St. Catherine of Siena, and love for the church, etc., etc. And if you already put this around or sent this around.
Sure, send it through that way first.
Yeah.
Use that follow-up on Mike.
Remember, I sent it around.
John, my question is looking at the laity and looking at where we're setting right now, again, like a few thousand years ago. What can we do as laity to maybe make a change, to do a change, to help this? For some reason, that's very heavy on me right now. It's like,
there's a
I
reason
need to
for
do
that.
something, but I don't know what.
I think that part of the answer to that discussion is that the world believes in activism. And a good activist is raised up in the news, in the media, social justice warriors, whatever you want to call them. But an activist who takes care of people in the soup line, always raised up. Why that is, I don't know. But if you get a guy who does the soup line, he's going to make the paper, especially if he's looking for news. But to be honest with you, not that the soup line is something we should do, but it's not the right place with that attitude. In fact, get away from it. Of course, now that's my answer, Brian.
I just, when you said that made me think, because I had a similar question that I was thinking about asking. I feel like we're often shown the examples of the priests and the religious, which we're not, and then we don't know how to translate that spirit into what we do as lay people. And then too often we think that because we try to translate that way, we're trying to take on this leadership role, which isn't necessarily what we're called to do. So I wonder that too. How do we translate that spirit into what and who we are as lay people?
That's a really good question.
Whenever I'm struggling with, like, Lord, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do? I'm the nagging woman. What do you want me to do, Lord? What do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? What do you want me to do?
He finally gets tired of you.
And then he says, the dishes. Can't answer. Sorry to be honest.
Come on over.
And then he reminds me, the question is, who am I called to be? Who am I called to be in this moment? Who am I called to serve in this moment? And then because of the activist spirit of the age, that's what we feel like that's what drives us. Like, it's almost it's like almost a drive in desolation. I feel like I need to
It's a way to resolve that.
get myself out of
feeling.
this
Yeah.
without calling on God to say, like, who am I supposed to be in this moment? And usually the answer is as a wife and a mother, so that's why the dishes are always like, you know what I mean? Because I'm like, what am I supposed to do? Like, you have a big grand thing for me to do, Lord. And Lord's like, I've given you plenty of things to do, just look around your house.
Dishes are omnipresent.
Yeah.
But
So in the little things we can do, like serve one another in that spirit of like, out of love of God in that way. Who am I called to be to the people around me and the people that I can influence instead of feeling like we need to be leaders in the grand scheme. And in time, if that is possible, like Mother Teresa served one person at a time. And in the beginning, it was like, Lord, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? And it's like one person at a time. But like in the end, she was the same, right? So it's like we might feel this grand scheme that like God is calling us to, but we can only make a difference like 5%, like just make a 5% difference, you know, instead of thinking like I have to make 100% difference all of the time every day.
Isn't that the participation, that is a participation in evangelical counsel of obedience, right? When we do our daily duty, Our Lady of Fatima, she had a couple requests, and one of them was to do your daily duty, right? That's that participation. And all the counsels, there are means to an end. The end is charity, because charity is the perfection of Christian life. You may be in a state of perfection, but you can be imperfect in a state of perfection. And you may be in a state of imperfection, but you can be perfect in a state of imperfection. There's a famous example of a lay person who, I think it's St. Paul, was raised up to be very perfect so that St. Anthony of the desert would not be proud. So he saw that Paul exceeded him in some way despite the fact that he was living in the world. Now, he did go and become his disciple, right? That's how we got to know him. But so, yeah, don't despise the counsels, but they're not the end, the means.
The means. I think I wanted, this body of questions and observations is really good, and I just want to make a comment. And I like the way Brian framed it, the spirit, because there's a spirit of activism that we want to respond to. I'm particularly aware of that fault myself, because when I was young, I got involved in politics and went back to DC and worked and thought, oh, I was conquering the world. And then, and that activism, it kind of hit me eventually that you hit a certain time involved, you realize nothing really changes. Well, absolutely nothing changes. Although it's getting worse.
Nothing changes for the better.
And when I came home from that work, which I loved, I got, I was working and raising kids, and I got 4 children, and they're great guys, great people. And I got involved with the Idaho Family Forum on their board of directors. Oh, here we go. And I realized that this is not the answer, because all they're doing is spinning wheels in this world. Now, do they do good work? Yes. And they bring a lot of attention to people and bring information and deliver it. I'm not discounting that work, because we have to be a presence in this life. But for us personally, are these the things to do? Part of the answer to the question is that a human being wants to do that. And I think part of the answer, and I think, Max has touched on this, everybody's, Alon's definitely touched on it, is that one thing that is I was told by a nun, I remember not, when I was relatively young and coming out of that activism, and she says basically, go home and raise your kids well and love your wife. That's it. That's it. That's activism. That's the right way. Because what her point was, which there's no magic to this, there's no great wisdom, is that if you raise your kids well, and they hit 30 and 40 and 50, they pay their taxes, they live well, and they obey God, they will flip society on its head. And everybody who does this will change Idaho, will change society for the better. So the activists who are doing this, oftentimes, and I remember seeing this, I can't remember who it was or where, there was a woman I met whose family was in utter destruction, yet she was involved in all of the activities in the world. She was going to change everything. And what ended up with that rule that I got from that nun is she was going to change nothing, because it's all a squirrel in a cage. And the reality is that our prayers, the other thing is prayer is activism too, in one real way. Activism helps us keep, or that kind of activism, prayer keeps us steady, keeps us focused on our daily duties. And the other thing is it helps secure, because St. Paul in the book of Galatians says, I opened it up, we pray for the emperor. Look, this is very strong message he gave. And it's controversial, but why? So that we can live in peace. And what he's saying is those prayers make a difference. He didn't say king, he didn't say president, he said the emperor. We pray for him so that we can keep the peace and live. Because this world's transitory. So prayer is another activism that we can involve in. Pray for our government. Pray for the incoming president, that he stays secure and makes sense. And don't follow radicalism and go off the deep edge. Because the reality that we talked about a moment ago is in unreality is being grasped by a lot of people. The right to kill kids. I can kill a kid in the womb when I want to. Or I can become a woman when I want to. The unreality lies are assuming, but your prayers can change everything. Look, you may have the desire to do something. We all do. We're all tempted. But the question is, we're all more than tempted. Sometimes we commit sins, more often than not. But the reality is, it's walking the Via Apostolica to perfection. And that's what we're called to. Do we always meet it? I know I don't. But activism is a nature, part of our human nature, and we fight against it. And part of fighting against it is prayer, staying close to family, friends, and being a Dominican.
John, I think there's a way in which activism is appropriate, and you see it in a lot of these families that are homeschooling, where they're really putting all their effort into bringing up their kids well. And what they do is they bring their kids with them.
Yeah.
And you see this particularly in the pro-life movement.
Right.
40 Days for Life will be there with all their children. And this teaches their children about the larger community, and lets their children see their virtue, right?
It makes them see good people.
Right.
I mean, go to a pro-life march, by the way, there's one next Saturday. Go to a pro-life march, and then you kind of need to be around just really neat people. Being around a community of Catholics who care deeply, very passionate. There was a Protestant I read on, at this really good point, I'll shut up, but he was a convert, and he made a point, I think it was on the radio, he says, you know, Protestants, I realize the little old ladies have the passion in the Protestants. They're great. They pray, they're always active. But he said, I found out that it was the young men in the Catholic Church that are the same way. They have an unknown devotion to Christ, and they're active in their church. And there's a certain beauty to that. Obviously, a certain beauty when it comes to being young and active in prayers and participation, and for the right reason. And I shouldn't also, in closing, say, I'll end in just a sec though, if you're called to participate, and I believe at one point I was called to get involved in politics, and that was for a time, my son is in it now, God does call people to politics, to law, to cleaning the yard, to doing things that they're called and have a skill to do. Those vocations comes from the Latin voca, meaning called. Doing your job well, be it the priest here or the secretary over here, is a call. And God says, do it well. That's part of it. But activism for the sheer sake of activism is a natural, not a supernatural, part of the supernatural order. So anyway. Anything else? That's a good thing. Is anybody online? Anybody hear us?